A scope you've seen us use in quite a few videos and magazine articles, the Riton 1 to 6 by 24 millimeter. Quick overview coming up next on GBGuns. So in going over optics, there's a lot of different ways to do it because there are a lot of personal preferences, and optics really are about personal preferences. What I'm going to do is give you an overlay of the features and feel, as well as a view through the scope of the reticle at different zoom and different targets, so you give an idea for it. As far as any technical specs, check out the manufacturer's website. Always the best place to get that stuff, not from YouTube. Alright, so 1 to 6 by 24. What is this for? This is generally your close to mid-range type application. 1 to 6 by 24 is how that is properly discussed. 1 to 6 being your zoom range, 24 being the millimeter size of the objective lens here on the front. What does that mean to you? Well, the one thing to keep in consideration is exit pupil size. This is how big the image out the back side of the scope is. Flip this around. For some reason, left to right always seems more appropriate. So that number, the human eye typically can do 3 to 7 millimeter is what's comfortable. When things are off or too small, that's when you start to get lots of the shadowing inside the scope, or you're only seeing a partial image, things like that. 3 to 7 millimeter is generally the comfort spot. You can go beyond that. That's when either it's so big it doesn't matter where your head is to see through the scope, like on a 1 power for example, or it's so tiny that it seems like if you don't hold your mouth just right, you can't see through the scope. 1 to 6 by 24, the way you determine what the exit pupil is going to be is divide that objective lens diameter, 24 millimeter, by your max power, 6. You end up with 4. Approximately 4 millimeter is going to be the size. That means that with this thing all the way up on 6, you're going to have to be careful with your head positioning. With it all the way down at 1, you'd have a 24 millimeter objective. That means you can be pretty quick and sloppy, which is what makes these such a popular scope setup, 1 to 6 to 24 that is. There are 8 powers, there's even 10 powers. The problem when you get up on higher power is that exit pupil gets smaller, and you've got to really start being careful where you position yourself behind the optic to get any picture whatsoever. There are some exceptions to these rules. They're not really a rule, they're advice, but that's what I go off of, and that's why I stick with 1 to 6 by 24. So with this particular scope, we'll get to the reticle and looking through it later on. Just in an overview, you have a diopter back here to be able to adjust and focus the reticle to your eye. That's nice and smooth, and it has, if I can find it, there we go, a little dot right there to help you know where you tend to like it. Now if you put the included scope caps on, of course you can't see that anymore. You notice this has some nice knobs to it. You end up having to twist the cap instead of this piece. Whatever. Moving up, we've got our zoom ring, which has some nice knurling to it, plenty of traction there, and it's a fairly stiff zoom, which is why it's nice it has this throw lever. Throw lever is not huge, and I'm okay with that. It means less likely to snag on things. You notice it doesn't stick out much further than any other part of the scope, but it does give you a little extra leverage for turning. It is a left to right zoom, or sorry, right to left zoom, meaning starting on the right. And to show you positioning, it's about the 4 o'clock at 1 power. And to come to 6 power, you're coming all the way back over the top to about 7 o'clock. Whether or not you prefer to reach up with your support hand to come from 1 power to 6 power, or if you prefer to reach with your firing hand, that's a personal preference. I got used to the left to right movement, coming this way to zoom in, then bringing my hand back down to the firing position, but it's a personal preference thing. It being this stiff, I appreciate, because that means it's less likely to get bumped. So if you're running this on a quick and ready shooting type scenario, which is what this zoom range is appropriate for in these reticles. Bumping against yourself or your gear, you can see that my zoom is not adjusting there at all, so that's a positive. As far as illumination, it's locked with offs in the intermediate positions, meaning between it's off. You pop out and turn to bring it on, and then you can push in to lock it down again, which is nice. I like the offs in intermediate spots. If you know that you're more likely to use higher power or lower power kind of thing, you can set it off next to one of those ready spots. This goes up to 6. So say leaving it here, now I know up and just down 1 gives me a little bit of brightness, or coming the other way to max. So that's a nice feature there, especially having that locked. It runs on a 2032 battery, which is commonly available. Greatly appreciate that. These nice big fat caps keep your adjustments from getting bumped. It's half MOA, meaning adjusting roughly half an inch of impact when at max zoom at 100 yards. And our marking, you can see we have, camera cooperate with us, a little marker right there to tell us what we're actually lining up to, and it's marked with lefts and rights from the original 0. You can then loosen this cap, turn the dial, set it back down, tighten it to set your new absolute 0. Clicks are nice, tactile and audible, and returns back to the same spot. As far as being able to see this line up with a spot there on the side, it's not something I'm too concerned about in a 1:6x24. You're basically getting it set to your combat 0, if you will, and leaving it alone. Plus, you can use the reticle for any adjustments on the fly. More on that when we get to the reticle. Our vertical adjustments are set up the same way. See that you'll need to redefine your 0 if you have to come down below the initial 0. Feels a little different one way or versus the other. Does that really matter? Not on a scope like this. Now we'll go outside and I'll give you a look at the reticle. Let's head out there and do that. And here, of course, is the tricky part. If you think lining up your eye behind the scope is tough enough, try doing it with the camera. Keep in mind, we're now using a lens to judge a lens plus whatever screen you're watching this on, but I wanted to give you an idea of what the reticle looks like as mounted. This is the Riton 1:6x24. I've got it on top of an AR-15 16-inch upper, so you can kind of see a little bit of rail there. And we're starting with the camera zoomed back a little bit. Come in, reticle's not able to come in focus for the camera at this power, but as we zoom in, you'll be able to see it. That fence post is about 8 yards away, and that dark tree is 135 yards away. As I zoom this in up to 6 power, you should be able to start seeing the reticle. Sorry, this is a very stiff zoom lever. One of my probably few complaints about this particular optic. The illumination is on maximum brightness. If I try to play with our lens a little bit, see if we can get focus. And there you go. Now it's clear. This lens is at 55 millimeters on an APS-C camera, so take that into consideration as well. But you can see the illumination gives you enough red to be able to find the reticle in daylight on a dark target. If I turn that illumination off, again, it's a locked adjustment, which I kind of like. There's your reticle, non-illuminated. As far as any flare you're seeing, that can also be part of the whole camera setup, which is one of the reasons why so few people do things like this. But I wanted to get a feel for what it looks like through the scope. I'm going to try to bring the zoom back to about the mid-range. go. Now you can see, and I'm going to adjust our camera a little bit so you can see the quality of the image through there versus around the sides. It's not going to work too well. As far as subtensions on the reticle, that'll be posted on the screen so you can see how useful this is for target size adjustment or for calling your shots. Bring that back to 6. And as you can see, the advantage with first focal plane and why I like first focal plane is your reticle is always true, meaning whatever subtensions that reticle is can be used to truly evaluate size or how far off your shots are, things like that. It also means you don't have to worry about what zoom it's on when you make your adjustments. I hope that footage comes out decent for you. This has a cool reticle with that sort of bracketing diamond. So at low power, when illuminated, it serves very much like a red dot to give you a way to center your target, and then at higher power kind of draws your eye in. I appreciate the first focal plane simply because that means any adjustments you make are not sensitive to your zeroing. On a second focal plane scope, that's the type where the reticle does not zoom in and out with you. You always have to have the scope preset at the manufacturer's determined zoom for your adjustments here to apply per the reticle. Usually that's at max zoom or somewhere around there. First focal plane, that's not a concern. Sometimes first focal plane reticles can be too tiny at minimum power and too thick at max power. On a 1:6x24 like this, you don't really have to worry about that. So that is my overview of the Riton 1:6x24. If you want to know subtensions and little details like that, head over to ritonoptics.com and they will be able to point you in the right direction. Overall, I've been very pleased with this scope. Thanks for watching.